Welcome to Racial Bonds, a submission to the 2020 Ethics for Next Generation of AI Hackathon. Our team consists of Jasmine Moore, Daria Aza, and me, Willie Costello. Jasmine conducted critical research and provided key conceptual framing for this project. Daria and I performed statistical analysis and made the data visualizations, which you'll see, and I also did the web design. So let's begin. The issue that we're addressing in this webpage is the issue of mass incarceration and pretrial detention in the United States. This issue is particularly pressing because of the hundreds of thousands of individuals who are detained in local jails and prisons. 63% of these people are unconvicted and awaiting trial. This has not only a human cost, but also an economic cost and a social cost, as persons of color make up nearly 70% of individuals in pretrial detention, despite making up only a quarter of the United States population. Now, there are various factors contributing to these issues, but here we're going to be focusing just on one in particular: the use of algorithms and data via pretrial risk assessment instruments, or PRIs. Now, PRIs are intended to standardize pretrial decision-making, and they do this by predicting a defendant's likelihood of reoffending or failing to appear in court. And they do this on the basis of data to try to more objectively determine a defendant's likelihood of reoffending, rather than letting that decision be the result of human biases. Now, PRIs are not only used to predict a defendant's likelihood of reoffending. These algorithms are also used to set the terms of the defendant's detention, for example, by setting the amount of their bond. But there is a concern with these algorithms. The concern is that the data that these algorithms are trained on may be biased, due to the association between many of the risk factors these algorithms consider and systemic, social, and economic inequities. The problem, however, is that it's difficult to know if these biases exist and are being translated to the algorithm when we're unable to inspect the algorithms themselves. Indeed, how can we know if the algorithms are having these effects when we cannot look inside them? The goal of this webpage is to do just that, but study the impacts of such algorithms indirectly by investigating the racial disparities in the pretrial inmate population that results from the use of these pretrial risk assessment algorithms. The purpose of this webpage is educational, to share information and raise general awareness of these issues through statistical analysis and data visualizations. And to do so, we're going to focus in on a particular case study, the state of Connecticut, which has been using a pretrial risk assessment algorithm since 2003. The state has also, since 2016, made available data on all of its pretrial inmates. And while we don't know everything about these inmates that the risk assessment algorithm did, we do know several points of information about them: the amount of their bond, the number of days they were detained, and the offense for which they were arrested, and their race. So let's begin. If we look at the overall racial demographics of Connecticut's pretrial inmate population, the numbers are clear. Black people have always made up the largest number and proportion of these inmates. White people made up the next largest number, although recently their numbers have been roughly equivalent with Latinx people. Now you might wonder, are these numbers any different from the state of Connecticut's racial demographics? And they clearly are. The overwhelming majority of the state's population is white, and yet the overwhelming majority of its pretrial inmate population are people of color. And it's not just that inmates of color are disproportionately represented in this population. Inmates of color also tend to be assigned higher bond amounts than white inmates. Now you might wonder, is this difference in bond amounts because inmates of color tend to be arrested for different offenses, in particular for more serious offenses that would carry higher bond amounts? The answer here is no. Even if we keep the specific offense fixed, the median bond amount for inmates of color is often significantly higher than for white inmates. Again, you might ask, is this difference because inmates of color tend to be repeat offenders? And again, the answer is no. The relative proportions of first-time and repeat offenders are nearly the same between white inmates and inmates of color, and the difference in their median bond amounts has nothing to do with whether they have been arrested for a repeat offense. You might also wonder if gender is an issue, and here the answer is more complicated. For male inmates of color, the situation looks much the same, but for women of color, the situation looks a little better. In many cases, the median and maximum amounts of their bond are usually comparable to what white female inmates are assigned. Still, there are some offenses where female inmates of color are discriminated against. It's hard to say what might explain these differences in gender, but one interesting finding of our statistical analysis is that in the male population, black inmates make up the majority, whereas white inmates make up the majority of the female pretrial inmate population. So what explains these clear racial disparities in the data? We know that Connecticut's algorithm explicitly ignores the defendant's race when making its risk assessments. But we also know that it considers other data about them, factors such as the defendant's marital status, employment history, level of education, history of substance abuse, mental health, and prior failure to appear in court. Now the question is, should the terms of a defendant's pretrial detention be determined by these factors, given the association between these factors and systemic, social, and economic inequities? The question we must ask ourselves is this justice? Or is it perpetuating society's existing inequities? We close by noting that Connecticut is not unique in its use of prize. In fact, prize are in use all over the country, in at least one county in almost every state. But we also want to end on a more positive note. Although these results may seem alarming and overwhelming, we do believe that successful adoption and ethical use of prize is possible. And so we close this webpage by highlighting the District of Columbia's use of prize, which has shown that the proper use and vetting of these instruments, combined with pro-social interventions and minimally restrictive non-financial release options, can foster positive results for defendants. And lastly, we close with a call to action and encourage our readers to get involved with organizations that fight for algorithmic justice.